Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back, AP, and let's go ahead and get into it where we left off in class, right? We were talking about this guy, and we were talking about the rise of conservatism and the extreme forms of conservatism that Clemens von Metternich was advocating for post-Napoleonic Empire within Europe, right? So we were discussing all those ideas, and we left off discussing, conservative kryptonite, self-determination, constitutional systems, the Holy Alliance versus the Quadruple Alliance, the alliance within the alliance. We were discussing the dual revolution, that now we've got to figure out how to suppress economic liberal theory and suppress political socialist theory and all these other things that the conservatives were fighting against. We also discussed why didn't the liberals and the socialists just unite against the conservatives, but a lot of it's because they don't have the same beliefs. But we left off talking about how the heck do you fight this dual revolution, right? Well, one of the biggest ones that they used, and we talked about this in class, was use your military force. Use your extreme military force to when a constitutional system begins to rise up. You can just go in there and you can crush it. And we use Spain and the two Sicilies example, right? Now, another big one is going to be you have to use your smarts, right? So you got to try and use like an intellectual little thing you can do. So one of the big ones in 1819 were these things called the Carlsbad Decrees, right? And the Carlsbad Decrees are going to officially do some very important things. One, it's going to reorganize all the German principalities that used to be inside of the HRE that are now a part of the German Confederation as of 1806, and it's going to create them, well, actually, it was the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806, so as of 1815, it was the German Confederation, and it's going to take them from 90 principalities and organize them into about 38 of them. Now, the way Metternich was thinking about it, if we can organize them down into about 38 principalities versus 90 and install 38 people that are loyal to conservative governments, we will be able to easily and efficiently suppress popular revolts and revolutions there later, right? And he was right about this early on. But later, this guy, Otto von Bismarck, is going to show up and basically rule the day because he's going to create what you now know as modern-day Deutschland, or Germany, right? So that's during the German unification process. And we'll talk about him later. I love Bismarck. It's always better to have two irons in the fire. Laws are like sausages. No, everybody loves them, but nobody wants to see them get made. He's got a lot of dope quotes. He's a great dude and an awful dude all at the same time, but he's mostly pretty cool. Now, anyway, but also a secondary part of the Carlsbad Decrees was to try and say, we're going to plant spies inside of universities, right? And we're going to listen to what these teachers are teaching their students and their pupils. Are they socialists? Are they liberals? And if they are, we're going to replace them. And so they basically had spies inside of colleges and stuff like that to try and root out subversive ideas, right? So the Carlsbad Decrees are a great example of how extreme these things are getting and how the conservatives are trying to infiltrate their way into society just to prevent the spread of these liberal or socialist ideas, right? Now, we're now derivating a little bit away from Metternich. So you can put like a dotted line in your notes and be like, okay, we're done with Metternich for a little while now. But the big thing that you need to understand is that there's a virus growing inside of conservative empires, right? So we have several empires of the day. We have the Russian Empire, we have the Ottoman Empire, we have the Austrian Empire. We have all these empires, right? And what's the key element of an empire? An empire is controlled by an emperor or a central figure. We even had the Napoleonic Empire. And they control multiple different nationalities or groups of cultural people that are not their own, right? So if I had an empire, right, if we made a Chappelle empire, we would take over Mount Carmel and Dominican, right? So, and since we took them over, they're now a part of our empire. They're under our banner. They go under our flag, but they believe themselves to be different because they don't speak our language, or they don't have our colors, they don't have our songs, they don't have our things, right? So, even though everybody would love to be in the Chappelle empire, let's be honest. Now, anyway, but the big thing, though, is the virus of an empire is nationalism. The worst thing you could have is for Dominican or Mount Carmel to start realizing that they are different from you and that they deserve their own country, right? So this goes with self-determination as well. So nationalism is this idea that each people had its own genius and its own unity, okay? So basically, nationalism revolves around the idea that what's going on in Europe post-fall of Napoleon and under the conservative reign of Metternich is that countries and people are beginning to say to themselves, our people have a genius of their own. We speak German. We have recipes that are German. We have foods that we love. We have holidays all our own. We have dress and style and songs and music that is quintessentially our own, right? We would say that Americans have a genius of themselves, right? We have sports and things and traditions and all these things that we believe are amazing and not necessarily better than anybody else. Some people believe that, but like not necessarily better than anybody else, but something that just is, right? It just is. So the big things that revolve around these nationalism ideas are common language and history and things like that, important elements that all affected their people universally. But then going forward during this period, though, post-1815 fall of Napoleon for the second time after his 100 Days campaign, this is going to lead to the desire for independent states, okay? Now that desire for independent states, that's self-determination, okay? That's what I mean, okay? We're talking about that is a big, disgusting conservative kryptonite element, right? Metternich hates nationalism. Put that in your chart. Put that in your chart. Conservatives hate nationalism, right? They don't like it because if you have to deal with that, they only like nationalism if it's of their own people. But if it's of the people that they control, they don't like it, okay? So during this period, though, they can't stand the nationalist idea. So jump back to your chart. But conservatives hate nationalism. Now, really quick, though. These ideas are beginning to grow because there were too few states, right? It didn't make any sense. If you jump all the way back to that really, really, really big concert of Europe map, can I keep going backwards? Keep going backwards. Keep going backwards. Why did you do that? I hate you so much. All right, here we go. There we go. So if I jump over this map, right, we're looking at it. In all actuality, given the fact that Europe contains over 20 different languages, 20 different cultures, and 20 different cultural groups, there's not enough countries. Looking at this map alone, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, like 11 or 12. You've got 50% of the countries necessary needed to try and create what you would consider modern-day Europe. And it's even over 20. It's closer to 30, probably over 30, right? Different cultural groups and language groups, okay? So since there's not enough groups, people, or countries, nationalistic tempers are beginning to flare, all right? So that's very, very important that we understand. These movements did not erupt until later, but the nationalistic tension and idea begins in the mid and early 1800s, right? Because of Napoleon taking over everything and trying to impose a French culture on the entire country, nationalism begins to grow. But then after the Congress of Vienna and people being like, why am I still under Austrian control? Because the Austrians didn't like they were about to be under French control, and I don't like that I'm about to be under Austrian control, so they are going to have desire for self-determined states as well, okay? So that's not going to erupt until the 1800s, but it's important to know that the seeds of nationalism were sown during this time period, okay? But now we have to discuss a very important thing. We have to talk about where the heck socialism came from, okay? Now, some people would say, well, Mr. Terry, why didn't we talk about where liberalism came from? Well, liberalism is kind of cut and dry, right? Liberalism is the product of the Enlightenment, okay, because it's coming from Enlightenment social and economic theory, okay, personal rights, inalienable rights, my rights, individualism, owning of property, John Locke, etc., etc., etc. Also, owning my own money, Adam Smith, right? Separating my government powers, Montesquieu. That's your classical liberals, okay? Your socialists, on the other hand, are so far over to the left during this time period that they're taking up a completely new idea in a new space. So it's very, very important to discuss them, right? Where they came from, okay? So socialism, what it is it's a backlash against the individualism of the Industrial Revolution and the fragmentation of society, right? It's a move toward cooperation and a sense of community. Hence why communism is called communism in the community aspect, right? Communal. Now, important thing to know also, though, before we get into this, communism, socialism, two different things, two different versions of a similar idea. But when people say socialism and communism are the same thing, they're not, all right? So it's just important to make that delineation, okay? Socialism is a very broad term. Communism is a specific idea that relates to that broad term, but it is not that term, okay? If that makes any sense. Now, socialism, though, was a big revolt against the Industrial Revolution and also against the suppression of the French revolutionary ideas by the Congress of Vienna and during the Concert of Europe period. So that what people are doing is they're saying, man, we should be more about each other in our communities, in our understanding, and be taking care of one another, and actually moving away from this idea of individualism, right? Let's remember, you don't need to write this down unless I didn't have it. You don't need to write it down. Remember the things they hate, right? Socialists during this time period hated class structure. They hated private property or any type of enterprise. I misspelled enterprise. It's supposed to have an E. I'm so dumb. Now, and then also, they hate free markets because they believe free markets are going to lead to the suppression of the working class, okay? Now, let's remember the things they love. They love government intervention, right? They love the fact that the government will become involved, regulate the economy, plan it, set prices for certain goods to help the poor, right? They love universal suffrage as well, that all men are allowed to vote, not necessarily just property right men. For example, liberals believe that suffrage should be limited, whereas socialists believe suffrage should be universal, okay? So I'm just trying to say they stand so far and away apart from each other. You didn't need to write those two things down, but it's important to remember. But guess where the socialist theory started? Where did socialism have its roots? Where is it from? Some people would look at you and be like, well, it's them Russians. Well, calm down. No, it's not. All right, so socialism started in France, right? Socialism is a product of the French Revolution, okay? Because the very first form of socialism that pops up is known as French utopian socialism. And it's going to have two very distinct thinkers early on that are going to begin to theorize the ideas of creating a utopian society and a socialist theory, right? So the great thing about this unit is when you have your excerpts for this unit, your multiple choice, it's kind of like clear as day when one's socialist, right? Because it's talking about no individualism, no property rights, no personal property rights, the community, right? So remember the bread of equality. If you wrote a question in your notes, I'm going to be really upset with you. But do you remember the bread of equality? That's a socialist theory, right? Let us ban every Danish, every donut, every petit four in France, and let us bring in this bread that has a set price and has everything for everyone, right? So where that comes from is a fear of individualism, right? Because this is what you need to write down. Socialism was born in the French Revolution out of a fear of individualism and laissez-faire competition. Now let's discuss that for a hot second. What is laissez-faire? Oh God, the capitalist classical liberals love some laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is the non-government intervention into economics. Completely free markets is laissez-faire, right? That Adam Smith advocated for laissez-faire economics. Like the economic thinkers of the day advocated for laissez-faire economics. Capitalism in and of itself revolves around the concept of laissez-faire economics, right? And it also revolves around individualism. If Malaya invents a spoon and no one knew what a spoon was, she invented that spoon for economic gain so she could make the money off selling those spoons, right? So socialism hates these concepts, right? They don't like laissez-faire economics because they feel that if a producer like Malaya starts owning a factory where it takes advantage of her spoon makers and her workers, that the government needs to come in and regulate her to prevent her from negatively impacting her workers, right? And then also, they don't like the fact that Malaya did not make that for her community, she made it for herself, right? So she made it so she could make the economic gain. So that's where socialism comes from. And revolutionary thinkers, okay, revolutionary as in not revolutionary by thought, but revolutionary as in relating back to the French Revolution, demanded that governments have a ran economy because competition would destroy the community, right? And create different social classes and create these people at the bottom and these people at the top. And people at the top would be willing to bury the people at the bottom to stay at the top, right? So key elements of socialist theory during this time period are economic equality, planned economy, and no private property or state-regulated private property, that everybody has a limit on how much property they can actually own. Now, to give you an understanding of how socialism could possibly have affected your state, y'all had a very, very famous politician by the name of Huey Long that was actually of the socialist mindset. There's a fantastic book written about him called All the King's Men. It actually is a historical fiction basis of his life, right? So those are the elements of it. And the very first guy, or one of the very first guys to actually theorize this idea is Count Henri de Saint-Simon. All right, so Count Henri de Saint-Simon. Now look, Count Henri is going to be one of the very first dudes to come up with the socialist theory. And he's going to propose French utopian socialism. And he broke society down into two separate groups. Now some of you are going to be like, oh, is it the workers and the upper class? That's communism. Calm down, okay? We'll talk about that when we get to the manifesto. Now, he broke society down into two basic formats. You got parasites and you got doers, all right? So parasites were anybody that he believed leached off the work or the hard work of working class people or the community itself. Church, lawyers, aristocracy, anybody that was there not to create or provide, they were there to take or infringe, is what he called parasites. because they got a lot of money, they got paid a lot of money without providing anything back to the community, right? The lawyers of their era were there to maybe defend somebody of a criminal charge or possibly to defend nobles when they actually sought more money, right? The aristocracy literally was founded on the idea of making more money, right? The church was created, and yes, of course, they provide essential services today, but at the time, he believed that they were just taking money from working people, okay, for salvation. Now, this is Henri's ideas. These are not mine. Now, look, doers, okay, on the other hand, were scientists, engineers, industrialists. He believed that those people could be the access point and the providers of work and actual good lifestyles for working class people. Now, he said, though, these had to be socialist-based doers, though. They cannot be doers of their own individualism. They had to be doers that are there to help out the community and the greater good regardless of their personal gain, right? Now, that's the problem. That doesn't really work very often. Now, he has faith. This is a key thing. He has faith in the doers to morally help the poor and create this thing known as the Age of Gold. Now, I do disagree with Henri de Saint-Simon on one factor. Scientists, businessmen, and industrialists, they don't make things for the benefit of other people. They make things to benefit themselves. Like, I'm not even going to sit here and lie to you. If I created some new form of paper that was, like, revolutionary, and I did that to make more money. I didn't do it for paper. You know what I mean? Like, I did it for a different kind of paper, I guess. Now, I'm just giving you a heads up, okay? Then, you're going to have another guy rise up, okay? And this is Fourier, all right? Now, after the Congress of Vienna, though, so Saint-Simon becomes active during the Revolution, right? And after the growth of industrialism and after the Congress of Vienna, socialists are going to turn their attack on capitalism. So Fourier comes after Saint-Simon, and he is also a utopian socialist as well. And he's a part of this new wave of thinkers, and they get more aggressive. It starts becoming less and less about socialist theory. It starts becoming more and more about socialist practice. How can we use this effectively and do it in real life? And so he says we should abolish marriage because marriage simply holds down women and it actually prevents them and treats them as property rather than treating them as human beings, right? And so he actually wanted to abolish marriage because he believed that it was treating women as property. We believe that Fourier is the very first person to come up with the term feminism, and he might have been one of the very first feminists, right? I believe that Olympia de Gaulle would be more of a feminist, or Mary Wollstonecraft would be more of a feminist, but Fourier is possibly the person that came up with the word feminism first. Now, some of you are probably like, okay, Fourier, I see you, I understand what you're getting at. Now, it's a little aggressive, though, because then he also says that we should break up every major city into communities of 1,620 people. So basically, he advocated for tribal communities or village setups, where every village would have certain people that provided a good to the community, and that the community would provide them with goods as well, and this would create up a perfect little utopian socialist area, okay? Saint-Simon's followers did not necessarily agree with this. They believed you need to be able to take the current model for socialism under the French utopian socialist theory and then use it to make the current society better, not necessarily dismantle society in the pursuit of socialism. So we're seeing a division of socialists now. We're seeing socialists disagree and agree at the same time. Saint-Simon's direct followers disagreed with Fourier's followers because Fourier was like, we're gonna abolish marriage and we're gonna have communities of 1,600 people and then the seas will fill with lemonade, which didn't happen. And then also, the Saint-Simon's followers are like, no, we shouldn't destroy every capital city. We still need governments and regulation, so we got to be able to set socialism up in an active form within the model that we have, right? So now we're seeing socialists dislike other socialists, which is going to be the origin of Marx in the later 1800s, right? Karl Marx rises out of this division to try and create a new ism, which his communism is separate from socialist theory, okay? Got it? All right, so very important that we understand that. Now, speaking of Marx, though, to understand socialist theory, to understand the growth of the isms, to understand the politics of the era, you have to understand that these ideas did not just come out of nowhere, all right? They did not just show up and like all of a sudden out of nowhere, everybody was like, socialism, the working class, this, that, and the other. They're technically all products of something that was going on the entire time, all right? Now we've got to get into what is known as one of my favorite things to discuss. It's called the Industrial Revolution, right? So we are now going to be discussing the Industrial Revolution, okay? So some of you are like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, you're telling me that we went all the way up to the mid-1800s just now, to the 1840s, and you're going to rewind on us and take me all the way back to 1730? I thought we were done with time period 2. Well, we got to jump backwards and kind of discuss how the Industrial Revolution was in the backdrop of the French Revolution the whole time. When you're talking about the Industrial Revolution when you're talking about the French Revolution, then you talk about Napoleon, then you talk about taking over everything, then you got to talk about the Congress of Vienna, then you got to talk about the conservatives, liberals, and socialists popping up during this time period. So you kind of got to discuss that first. So now we're going all the way back, and we're going to discuss what the Industrial Revolution is, right? So go ahead and give yourself a title, right? A little line somewhere in there, a little dotted line, a little area. And the big thing about it is we're now jumping backwards. And a lot of it has to do with the fact of where the Industrial Revolution started. Where did it begin? How did it get there? What's going on? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So the big thing about the Industrial Revolution is it's a term coined in the 1830s about the process that had already occurred before it to describe the burst of major inventions, economic expansion that took place, mainly in the textile industry and the iron industry, right? So usually when you're actually talking about the first Industrial Revolution, notice I said the first Industrial Revolution, you're discussing the growth of production in the textile and the iron industry, which would then later give way to the second Industrial Revolution, which happened in the later 1800s, which is much more focused around steam-powered mechanization and transportation, all right? So that is the Industrial Revolution. I love talking about the Industrial Revolution. I find it so fascinating to understand these giant societal changes and pivots, right? So going forward, we have to understand that the Industrial Revolution is a majorly important era, and it's going to take place primarily in Britain, okay? And we are going to discuss why it took place in Britain when we get to class, so we can create a nice list on the board, and then we'll go a little bit more further tilt with it. And as you can tell already looking at this, the Industrial Revolution, not long, right? It's only 30 slides, okay? We're not actually going crazy hardcore on this, okay? Because I believe it's not something that needs to be heavily focused on and loomed over, right? So, but the big thing, though, is we're going to talk about why it happened in Britain. We're going to talk about those political thoughts and theories. We're going to go into the Industrial Revolution. Then we're going to jump over to Romanticism. We're going to do a bunch of different stuff. But I'll talk to you guys then. Y'all have a good one.